it's absurd. We've seen recently some of the anti-China elements alleging that China intends to take over Japan. Nothing could be farther from that. I mean, ridiculous. What China does want is international respect, to resolve its civil war, which is unresolved, and to be left alone.
For the last few minutes, let's just talk about the Xi-Biden meeting that happened. What do you make out of that? And do you think it will influence or do you think there's a change in the way that the US is approaching China over the last couple of months?
I think it represented a recognition by both sides that things were getting out of control, and that the atmosphere had to be improved. And there was certainly an improvement in tone. There was no repeat of the diatribes at Anchorage with which the Biden administration began its dialogue with Beijing. Mr. Xi was on his best behavior. His speech to the American business community was a model of conciliation. His statements on the international order were reasonable and reasoned. I think he was playing to the global audience. You see, China is a reasonable country. You can live with us. We're not trying to impose anything on you. I think to some extent he succeeded. Having said all of that, there was absolutely no progress on the substantive divisions between the United States and China. No reconciliation, no new framework or restoration of the pre-existing successful framework for managing the Taiwan question, which is, after all, a U.S. dispute with China about China's borders, a U.S. dispute with a nuclear power about its sovereignty and territorial integrity. Now, we may have good ideological reasons for wanting to support Taiwan. Some people argue that there are geopolitical military reasons as well, which I don't find very persuasive, but there are those arguments. But the fact is, we're not managing that issue, and neither are Taipei and Beijing, and therefore it sits there as a ticking bomb waiting to go off. Now, Mr. Xi was quite clear. He had no desire to provoke a war over Taiwan. He didn't want a war over Taiwan. What he wants is a negotiated resolution of the issue. And what is the issue? The issue is the political relationship between Taipei and Beijing, not the sovereignty over Taiwan, because the world accepts that Taiwan is part of China. They don't accept that it's part of the People's Republic of China. No progress on that. There was a restoration of military-to-military communication, which would be very useful if we have an emergency, which we probably will. We have had in the past. The bombing of the Belgrade embassy, the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, the EP3 collision with a Chinese aircraft off Hainan Island. We've had such emergencies before. We've done nothing to prevent them in the future. But at least we now have restored a channel of communication to deal with them. I would be much more reassured, however, if we had tried to find ways to reduce the likelihood of emergencies. We did not do that. So I think this was a case, largely on the Chinese side, because American politics are frozen on this issue. China, I think, has its problems too. Mr. Xi went to San Francisco looking to renew China's image internationally after the foolish uses of so-called wolf warrior diplomacy had alienated people and made China seem unreasonable. He wanted to hold on to the constituencies in the United States that China has long enjoyed, especially the major business companies, and he wanted to demonstrate friendship despite divisions. He wanted to show that we could talk, notwithstanding our differences, and I think he succeeded at all of that. He also, in my mind, succeeded to some extent in reassuring a very nervous Chinese private sector that China would be open to business with its major trading partner, the United States, and that he was capable of dealing with the United States in a way that would preserve the possibility of profitable interactions with America. So those were his objectives. Mr. Biden wanted to show the American business community that he could deal with China. And he wanted to reassure them that there were limits to how far the decoupling would go. That remains to be seen. I suspect that we may have further evidence of new sanctions, new moves in the technology war with China in the future. So I say, well, the atmosphere has been improved, the tone of communications has been improved, but the substance of the relationship remains in a precarious position. This will have to be handled very carefully if we're not to have conflict.
My very, very last question, which is actually the same as before, but now about China. We know that inside the United States, we have certain neocon groups who are pushing very much toward more escalation as much as possible, right? And arming of Taiwan and actually really provoking China. Do you think that with the current meeting, this is kind of has been suppressed inside the US, or where do you see the forces that want to push for a war? Where do you see them in the political spectrum? Are they gaining in power or are they losing in power?
I think it's a draw. I don't see any major change one way or the other. Those who are convinced Sinophobes continue to stoke fear and engage in warmongering against China. They have and they are combating an imagined China, not the real one. The main problem we've had with China is not that it is communist, but perhaps that it is Leninist. It's been more successful at capitalism than almost anyone except perhaps Switzerland. So it isn't a case of the Chinese following a Soviet model of messianic export of an ideology intended to conquer neighboring countries or subjugate them. You know, it's absurd. We've seen recently some of the anti-China elements alleging that China intends to take over Japan. Nothing could be farther from that. I mean, ridiculous. So what China does want is international respect to resolve its civil war, which is unresolved, and to be left alone. It wants to solve territorial disputes that remain, as it has done in the past. Almost all its territorial disputes have been settled on quite generous terms for the other side. It has been prepared to settle the Indian border since 1954, and it has never retracted the basic offer of a trade-off between claims in the East and claims in the West. India has had great difficulty dealing with this because of the nature of democracy, which is very reluctant to do territorial transactions. This is something kings and dictators and communist parties can do, but not Indian Democrats. China can't deal with this Senkaku or Diaoyu issue until the issue of Taiwan is resolved, because it's the position of both Taipei and Beijing that these islands are part of Taiwan. It's Japan's position they are part of Japan. Now, you could have a negotiation, but you can't have it while Taipei and Beijing are at odds. Whoever is representing the Chinese side, both Taipei and Beijing, has to represent both, and they can't at present. So that is an issue that's on the shelf. China has issues in the South China Sea, where I think the solution is obvious, although difficult, and that is to apply the principle of 𝗕𝗏𝘂𝘁𝘂𝘁𝘁. Whatever you have, regardless of how you obtained it, which I object to, I will allow you to keep, because disturbing your possession would be worse than allowing you to retain it. So Vietnam's got 48 outposts in the South China Sea, which the Chinese regard as utterly illegal. China's got 7, the Philippines has got 9, Malaysia's got 3. Why don't they all call it off? You know, whatever you have, you keep. This is similar to the doctrine in at least Anglo-American law of adverse possession. If you possess part of your neighbor's property and he or she does not object for a sufficiently long period, he or she loses the right to object. So why did this come about? It came about because during the Cold War, China was contained by the United States and could not assert the claims which it had, which are at least as ancient, perhaps more so than those of any other claim. It's certainly more ancient than those of Vietnam and Malaysia, perhaps on a par with those of Vietnam. But of course, the Vietnamese complain that the records are all in Paris and the French won't share them, which I suppose is not unusual for the 𝗡𝗲𝘂𝘁𝗂𝘁𝘆, but is a little nasty, I think. Anyway, this could be resolved. Has there been an effort by anyone to resolve it? No. There have been efforts to deter China. Why does the United States or the West, why don't we argue that we should first settle the claims disputes between Vietnam, the Philippines, and Malaysia, all of whom dispute each other's claims, so that there's a united position of the non-Chinese claimants. They can negotiate as a bloc with China. This would make sense. But no, this is a convenient excuse for naval confrontation. And there it is. And on the Chinese side, the Vietnamese side, whatever. Every school kid grows up with a map showing that the whole South China Sea belongs to Vietnam, belongs to China, or is the West Philippine Sea, or whatever. Very hard to overcome this. But again, an application of adroit diplomacy and a willingness to seek a settlement rather than prolonged confrontation could deal with this. And I haven't seen it.
Ambassador Freeman, next time we talk, we have to discuss the issue between the Mare Liberum and Mare Clausum and the East and South China Seas. But this has to be a discussion for another time. Thank you very much for talking to me today, Ambassador.
Good to speak with you, Pascal. I wish you all the best.